If someone had told me that the person who would one day break my heart wasn't a stranger, or even an enemy, but my own twin sister, I would have smiled and said they were crazy. We shared the same birthday, the same face, and almost the same voice. For most of my life, people couldn't even tell us apart. I thought that meant we would always stand on the same side. Looking back now, I can see that our story didn't fall apart overnight. It started with little moments that seemed harmless at the time. I just didn't know those little moments were slowly becoming cracks that would one day tear my family apart. My name is Luna, and I was born exactly 5 minutes before my identical twin sister, Sophie. Growing up, everyone loved telling us how lucky we were to have someone who looked exactly like us. They imagined we'd be best friends forever. In many ways, we were. We wore matching clothes when we were little, celebrated every birthday together, and even finished each other's sentences. But being identical on the outside didn't mean we were the same on the inside. From the very first day of elementary school, our personalities couldn't have been more different. I loved meeting new people. Making friends came naturally to me, and I enjoyed helping anyone who needed it. I worked hard in class because I genuinely loved learning new things. My teachers often asked me to help other students, and I never minded. Seeing someone smile because I helped them always made me happy. Sophie wasn't a bad person. She just wanted attention in different ways. She hated being told no. If things didn't go her way, she'd get frustrated quickly. She wasn't interested in studying unless she absolutely had to, and she often complained that life wasn't fair. Sometimes she'd roll her eyes whenever a teacher complimented me. At first, I thought she was only joking. When we came home from school, I'd help Mom cook dinner before finishing my homework. I liked learning her recipes, and those quiet evenings in the kitchen became some of my favorite memories. After dinner, I'd usually sit with my grandparents on the porch. Grandpa loved history books, and Grandma enjoyed reading old novels. I'd listen to their stories for hours, completely forgetting about my phone or television. Our parents loved both of us equally. They never compared us, at least not on purpose, but people outside our home often did. Neighbors would say things like, "Luna is so responsible," or, "You're lucky to have a daughter like her." Every compliment they gave me seemed to leave an invisible mark on Sophie. I didn't notice it back then. I was too busy living my own life to realize my sister was quietly keeping score. One afternoon, when we were about 12 years old, Grandma smiled at me after I helped her organize a box of old family photos. She squeezed my hand and said, "One day you're going to build a beautiful family of your own." I laughed, hugged her, and didn't think much about it. But when I looked across the room, Sophie was standing in the doorway. She wasn't smiling. She was staring at me in a way I had never seen before. At the time, I thought it was just another bad mood. Now I know. That was the first time jealousy looked back at me. The older we got, the more obvious our differences became. By the time we started middle school, people no longer saw us as the twins. They saw us as Luna and Sophie. We looked exactly alike, but our personalities made it easy for everyone to tell us apart within a few minutes. I never tried to stand out. I simply enjoyed working hard, being kind, and treating people with respect. Somehow, that seemed to open doors for me without me even noticing. Teachers trusted me with extra responsibilities. Classmates invited me to birthday parties and study groups, and neighbors often stopped to chat whenever they saw me outside. I was grateful for all of it because I never expected special treatment. I just wanted to be the kind of person others could depend on. Sophie, on the other hand, became more distant as the years passed. She wanted people to admire her, but she didn't like putting in the effort it sometimes took to earn that respect. If someone received praise, she wanted the same praise. If someone succeeded, she wanted the same success. Whenever things didn't happen the way she imagined, she blamed everyone except herself. There were days when she was funny, caring, and impossible not to love. Then there were days when the smallest disappointment could ruin her mood for hours. I kept telling myself it was just part of growing up. Teenagers change. That's what everyone said. At home, life still felt peaceful most of the time. Mom loved having me in the kitchen while she cooked dinner. She taught me family recipes, little cooking tricks, and even how to plan a weekly grocery budget. Dad often joked that one day I'd run a business because I treated every dollar like it mattered. After dinner, I'd usually carry 2 cups of tea to the living room where my grandparents were waiting. Grandpa loved talking about history, while Grandma always had another novel she wanted me to borrow after she finished reading it. Those evenings became my favorite part of the day because they made our house feel warm, safe, and full of love. Sophie rarely joined us anymore. She usually stayed in her room, scrolling through her phone or talking to friends online. Sometimes Mom would ask her to help with dinner, but she'd complain that it was boring or say she was too tired. Nobody forced her. Our parents believed we were old enough to make our own choices. Looking back, I wonder if that freedom quietly allowed the distance between us to grow without anyone realizing it. One evening, while I was washing the dishes, I overheard Sophie talking to one of her friends in the hallway. She didn't know I could hear her. I wasn't trying to listen, but one sentence caught my attention. "I hate that everyone thinks she's perfect." I froze for a second, then convinced myself she was just having a bad day. She was my sister, my best friend. I couldn't imagine that those words were more than a moment of frustration. I finished the dishes, smiled when she walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, and acted as if I hadn't heard a thing. I had no idea that those quiet feelings she kept hiding were slowly becoming something much darker. By the time we reached high school, life became more complicated. People started thinking about college, part-time jobs, and first relationships. It felt like everyone was trying to figure out who they wanted to become. Sophie and I still looked so much alike that new students often mixed us up, but our classmates who had known us for years never did. They knew I was the quieter one who spent more time studying than chasing attention, while Sophie loved being noticed. Even though we shared the same face, we were living completely different lives. That was the year Liam became part of our story. He had transferred to our school at the beginning of junior year. He was polite, easy to talk to, and the kind of person who made everyone around him feel comfortable. We first met during a group science project, and over the next few months we naturally became friends. There was nothing dramatic about it. We laughed during lunch, helped each other with assignments, and slowly built a friendship that felt honest and effortless. I never noticed the way Liam looked at me, but Sophie did. One afternoon, she casually asked me what I thought about him. I shrugged and smiled. "He's nice, that's all." She nodded, but there was something strange in her expression that I couldn't quite understand. A few weeks later, one of Sophie's friends quietly told me that Sophie had started liking Liam. I was surprised because she had never mentioned it to me. I honestly didn't think much of it. Liam and I were just friends, and I believed that if Sophie liked him, maybe things would work out between them. But life had other plans. As the months passed, Liam and I grew closer without either of us planning it. We studied together after school, talked for hours about our dreams, and encouraged each other through every exam. Somewhere along the way, friendship turned into something deeper. Near the end of senior year, Liam asked if he could take me out for coffee. I said yes. When Sophie found out, she didn't yell or make a scene. She simply became very quiet. For days, she barely spoke to me. Then one evening she finally looked at me and said, "Funny how things always seem to work out for you." I laughed awkwardly and told her she was overthinking it. I reminded her that I had never known she liked Liam, and that I would never have intentionally hurt her. She forced a smile. "I know," she said softly. "Forget I said anything." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that one conversation had fixed everything. But some wounds don't disappear just because people stop talking about them. Sometimes they simply wait until the right moment to open again. After high school, life moved faster than either of us expected. Liam and I stayed together through college, supporting each other through long nights of studying, part-time jobs, and dreams that still felt far away. We weren't one of those couples who believed love solved every problem. We argued sometimes. We worried about money. We questioned ourselves more than once. But no matter how difficult life became, we always found our way back to each other. That quiet kind of love felt stronger than grand promises. Sophie chose a different path. She tried a few different jobs but never stayed in one place for very long. Every time something became difficult, she convinced herself that something better was waiting somewhere else. Whenever we met for coffee, she'd talk about people who had become successful overnight or couples who seemed to have perfect lives online. I always reminded her that social media only showed the good moments, but she would just shake her head and say I was too optimistic. A few months after graduation, Liam surprised me with a simple proposal. There were no cameras, no expensive restaurant, and no crowd cheering around us. It happened in the small park where we had spent countless afternoons talking about our future. He looked nervous as he held the ring in his hand and asked if I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. Before he even finished the question, I was already crying. I said yes without a second thought. When we told our families, everyone was excited. My parents hugged us both, my grandparents cried happy tears, and our relatives immediately started talking about wedding plans. Sophie smiled and congratulated us. She even helped me try on wedding dresses and stood beside me during every fitting. If anyone had asked me then, I would have said she was genuinely happy for me. Still, there were moments that didn't feel quite right. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at Liam while everyone else was laughing. Other times, she'd go completely silent whenever our wedding plans came up. If someone complimented my dress or talked about how lucky Liam and I were, she'd politely excuse herself and leave the room. I noticed it, but I kept making excuses for her. Planning a wedding could be emotional for anyone, especially when your twin sister was getting married first. Our wedding day was everything I had dreamed of. It wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with people who truly loved us. As I walked down the aisle, I saw Liam waiting for me with tears in his eyes, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. During the reception, I looked over at Sophie. She smiled, raised her glass toward me, and mouthed the words, "I'm happy for you." I smiled back because I believed her. Years later, I would replay that exact moment over and over in my mind, wondering if that smile had been real, or if it was the first mask my sister ever wore for me. A year after our wedding, our lives changed in a way that made everything else feel small. I found out I was pregnant. The moment I showed Liam the positive test, he pulled me into his arms and started laughing with pure joy. We had spent months talking about what kind of parents we wanted to become, and now that dream was finally becoming real. We spent the next few months preparing a small nursery in our house, painting the walls a soft blue, and picking out a wooden crib that Liam spent an entire weekend assembling himself. My parents were thrilled at the thought of becoming grandparents, and my grandfather immediately started setting aside a little money every month for the baby's future. Sophie seemed excited too. She bought a tiny teddy bear for the baby and even helped me organize the nursery closets. I was so grateful to have her close to me during such an important time. I truly believed that becoming an aunt would bring her closer to our family. When West was born on a rainy Tuesday morning, the entire world seemed to fade away. The moment the nurse placed him in my arms, I looked down at his tiny fingers and felt a kind of love I had never known existed. He was perfect. Liam sat beside the hospital bed, holding my hand and staring at his son with tears rolling down his face. Our family had never felt more complete. When Sophie came to visit us in the hospital, she stood beside the crib for a long time, looking down at West. She didn't say much at first, but when she finally looked up at me, her eyes looked tired. "He looks just like you, Luna," she whispered. I smiled and reached for her hand. "He looks like both of us," I reminded her. She gave me a tight, forced smile, then quickly changed the subject to talk about her new boyfriend, Ryan. She had met him a few weeks earlier and claimed he was different from any man she had ever known. He was ambitious, charming, and smart. I wanted to be happy for her, but something in her voice made me feel uneasy. It felt as though she was trying to convince herself more than me. As West grew, my life became a beautiful blur of sleepless nights, first smiles, and quiet afternoons in the living room. Liam worked hard to provide for us, but he always made sure to be home in time for dinner and bath time. We became a team in every sense of the word. Sophie and Ryan visited us often, but their presence always brought a strange energy into our home. Ryan was polite, but he spent a lot of time asking Liam questions about our business, how much money we were making, and what our future investments looked like. At first, I thought he was just being conversational. But one evening, while they were leaving, I noticed Ryan looking around our living room in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a look of admiration. It was a look of calculation. One night, when West was about 6 months old, I woke up around midnight to get him a bottle. As I walked past the living room window, I noticed a car parked at the end of our driveway with its lights off. It stayed there for nearly 10 minutes before slowly driving away. I told myself it was just a neighbor turning around, but a strange feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't mention it to Liam because he was already stressed with work, and I didn't want to worry him over nothing. I had no idea that the car wasn't a stranger at all. and that the people watching my home were the ones I trusted most. The next few months passed quickly, and West grew into a cheerful, laughing baby who filled our house with noise and happiness. He had just started crawling, which meant Liam and I had to spend our weekends baby-proofing every corner of the living room. It was exhausting, but we loved every minute of it. Sophie and Ryan continued to visit, but the tension between them was becoming harder to ignore. They argued frequently, usually in low whispers when they thought we weren't paying attention. From the few words I overheard, it was always about money. Ryan had lost his job at a local logistics company, and Sophie was struggling to pay her rent. My heart ached for my sister, and I wanted to help her. One afternoon, while Ryan was outside talking to Liam, I pulled Sophie into the kitchen and handed her an envelope containing enough cash to cover her rent for the next 2 months. "Take it, Sophie," I said softly. "You don't have to pay me back, I just want you to be okay." She stared at the envelope for a long moment before taking it. She didn't hug me, she didn't cry. She simply looked at me and whispered, "Must be nice to have so much extra money lying around." The coldness in her voice caught me completely off guard. I stepped back, unsure of what to say. Before I could respond, Ryan walked back into the kitchen, smiled warmly at me, and asked Sophie if she was ready to go. The transition in her face from bitterness to a forced smile was terrifying. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the empty space where my sister had been standing. I realized then that the money hadn't helped her feel supported. It had only fed the resentment she had been carrying since we were children. A few days later, Liam and I noticed something strange while reviewing our company's financial records. A small but noticeable amount of money was missing from one of our secondary accounts. It wasn't enough to hurt the business, but it was enough to cause concern. We spent hours checking our invoices, thinking it was a bank error or a mistake made by our accountant. Everything seemed correct on paper, yet the funds were gone. Liam decided to call the bank the following morning to look into it further. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the missing money, the car in our driveway, and the look in Sophie's eyes when I gave her the rent money. It felt as though the pieces of a puzzle were floating all around me, but I was too afraid to put them together because I didn't want to see what the finished picture looked like. The next morning, before Liam could call the bank, our attorney contacted us with unexpected news. He explained that someone had recently come into his office, claiming to represent our company, and had requested copies of our property deeds, including the paperwork for a small apartment we had recently purchased near the city center. We had bought that apartment as an investment, but we had also quietly planned to offer it to Sophie as a wedding gift if she and Ryan ever decided to get married. We wanted her to have a secure place to live, a foundation for her future. Our attorney had refused to hand over the documents because the person didn't have written authorization from Liam or me, but he wanted to warn us. When I asked him for a description of the person, he hesitated before answering. "It was a young woman, Luna. She looked remarkably like you." Hearing those words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed to keep from falling. I thanked the attorney, ended the call, and stared at the wall in complete silence. Liam walked into the room a few minutes later, seeing the pale expression on my face. "Luna, what's wrong?" I couldn't even bring myself to speak at first. When I finally told him what the attorney had said, his expression changed from confusion to absolute disbelief. He shook his head, refusing to accept it. "No, there has to be a mistake. Sophie wouldn't do that. Why would she try to steal the deeds to our property?" I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, a misunderstanding, anything else. But deep down, the voice I had been ignoring for years was finally speaking clearly. That afternoon, I called Sophie. She didn't answer. I texted her, asking her to come over so we could talk, but she didn't reply. The silence felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Later that evening, Liam and I were sitting in the living room while West slept peacefully in his nursery. The house was quiet, but the air felt thick with worry. Suddenly, Liam reached for his chest and gasped for air. His face turned completely white, and before I could even reach him, he collapsed onto the floor. I screamed his name, running to his side while pulling my phone out to call emergency services. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type the numbers. Within 10 minutes, the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics rushed him into the back. As the flashing red lights illuminated our dark street, I stood in the driveway holding West against my chest, watching the ambulance speed away. I felt completely alone, surrounded by a darkness that was closing in faster than I could run. The hours I spent in the hospital waiting room were the longest of my life. The smell of antiseptic, the bright fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of medical equipment made me feel like I was trapped in a nightmare. My parents arrived shortly after midnight, their faces lined with anxiety. Mom immediately took West from my arms, rocking him gently while he slept, while Dad sat beside me and wrapped his arm around my shoulders. Nobody spoke. There were no words that could comfort any of us. Around 3 in the morning, the doctor finally emerged from the intensive care unit. He looked exhausted but offered a small, reassuring smile. "He's stable, Luna. It was a severe heart attack, brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion. We managed to clear the blockage just in time. He's sleeping now, but he needs complete rest." A collective sigh of relief washed over us. I covered my face with my hands and allowed myself to cry for the first time since Liam had collapsed. The fear that had been holding me tight finally loosened its grip, if only for a moment. I stayed by his bedside for the rest of the night, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He looked so vulnerable lying there, surrounded by wires and monitors. I realized then how much pressure he had been under, trying to manage our growing business while carrying the secret worry of what was happening with my sister. The next morning, while Liam was still resting, I walked out to the hospital lobby to stretch my legs and get a cup of coffee. As I stood by the vending machines, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Sophie. I opened it quickly, hoping for a message of support or an explanation. Instead, the message read, "I heard about Liam. Life really knows how to put people in their place, doesn't it?" I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. There was no sympathy in her words. No love. It was a message filled with a twisted kind of satisfaction. I deleted the text immediately, refusing to let her malice enter the quiet space I was trying to preserve for Liam's recovery. I walked back to his room, sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside his bed, and took his hand in mine. I promised myself right then that I would protect my husband and my son from whatever darkness was coming. I just didn't realize that the darkness had already entered my home. Liam spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital before the doctors finally allowed him to return home. He had lost weight, and his movements were slower than before, but his smile was still the same. The doctors gave us a strict list of rules: no stress, no work, plenty of rest, and a complete change in diet. I committed myself entirely to his recovery. I managed the daily business calls from our kitchen table while West crawled around my feet, and I spent my evenings preparing healthy meals that Liam joked tasted like cardboard, but ate anyway because he knew how much I worried. My parents helped as much as they could, often taking West for afternoons so I could focus on Liam or get a few hours of sleep. The house felt quiet, almost fragile, as if a sudden loud noise could break the peace we were trying so hard to rebuild. Sophie never came to visit. She didn't call to check on Liam, and she didn't ask how I was doing. Her complete absence felt like a heavy weight, but in a strange way, it was also a relief. I didn't have the energy to fight with her or pretend that everything was fine anymore. One sunny afternoon, while Liam was napping upstairs and West was playing with his blocks in the living room, a knock came at the front door. My heart jumped slightly. Any unexpected sound made me nervous now. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and froze. It was a man I had never seen before, dressed in a dark suit and holding a leather briefcase. I opened the door slowly, keeping the safety chain attached. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man looked at me, then checked a piece of paper in his hand. "Are you Luna?" he asked politely. I nodded. He sighed and pulled an official-looking document from his briefcase. "I'm sorry to trouble you, ma'am, but I'm here to deliver a formal notice regarding the default on a business loan registered under your name and company details." I stared at him, my mind refusing to understand the words. "A loan? There must be a mistake. We haven't taken out any loans recently. Our company is completely debt-free." The man looked sympathetic but handed the document through the gap in the door. "According to our bank records, a loan for $50,000 was approved 3 months ago. The signatures on the paperwork belong to you and your husband. No payments have been made, and the account is now in severe default. If the balance isn't settled within 30 days, legal action will be taken against your property." My hands began to shake as I took the paper. I closed the door, unlatched the chain, and sank onto the hallway floor. The document in my hands had our company logo at the top. The signatures at the bottom looked exactly like mine and Liam's. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that neither of us had ever signed this paper. I spent the next 3 hours at our kitchen table, surrounded by financial statements, bank records, and the loan document. I didn't want to wake Liam, so I investigated the paperwork alone. As I looked closely at the details of the bank account where the $50,000 had been deposited, my breath caught. The account number belonged to a secondary business account we had opened years ago but rarely used. And when I looked at the digital authorization records, I saw that the email address associated with the online transfer wasn't mine. It was a variations of my name that had been created just a few months earlier. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place, and the truth was more painful than any lie. Sophie hadn't just tried to steal our property deeds. She had used our identical faces and my identity to forge signatures and take out a massive loan that could destroy everything Liam and I had built. I didn't cry. The sadness I had felt for weeks suddenly burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard anger. I called my dad and asked him to come over immediately to watch Liam and West. When he arrived and saw the expression on my face and the documents spread across the table, he didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and told me to do what I needed to do. I drove across town to Sophie's apartment, the loan documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. The sisterly love that had made me make excuses for her for years was gone. I was no longer just her twin. I was a mother and a wife protecting her family from a thief. When I reached her apartment building, I didn't take the elevator. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, every step fueling my determination. I reached her door and knocked loudly. For a minute there was silence inside. Then the lock turned and the door opened. Sophie was standing there wearing a comfortable sweater and holding a cup of coffee. When she saw me, her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she quickly recovered and leaned against the doorframe with a casual smile. "Well, look who it is. The perfect sister finally decides to visit." I didn't say a word. I pushed past her into the apartment, tossing the stack of loan documents onto her coffee table. The paper scattered across the dark wood, the forged signatures facing upward. Sophie turned around, her smile fading as she looked at the papers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing its casual tone. "You know exactly what it is, Sophie," I said, my voice dangerously calm. $50,000, forged signatures, an illegal loan taken out under my name. Did you honestly think the bank wouldn't find out? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" She stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at me. The guilt I expected to see wasn't there. Instead, her face hardened, and she let out a short, bitter laugh. "Of course you found out. You always find out everything, don't you, Luna? You always have to be the smart one, the responsible one, the one everyone feels sorry for." "You stole from my family, Sophie," I shouted, my calm exterior finally breaking. "Liam almost died 2 weeks ago because of the stress we've been under. We have a son to think about. How could you do this to us? How could you hate me that much?" Sophie took a step toward me, her eyes flashing with a rage that had been building for decades. "You want to know why? Because you took everything from me. Ever since we were kids, it was always, 'Luna is so sweet. Luna is so smart.' You got the perfect husband, the perfect house, the beautiful baby, the successful business. And what did I get? Your leftovers. People only looked at me to see if I was as good as you. I was tired of living in your shadow, Luna. I wanted what you had. Ryan and I needed that money to start our own business, to show everyone that I could succeed too." "By destroying me," I whispered, the sheer cruelty of her logic breaking my heart all over again. "We were going to give you that apartment, Sophie. We were planning it as a wedding gift. We wanted to help you, we loved you." For a split second, a look of genuine regret crossed her face. Her mouth opened slightly and she looked down at the floor. But before she could speak, the bathroom door opened and Ryan walked into the living room. He looked at me, then at the papers on the table, and immediately understood what was happening. He didn't look angry, he looked panicked. He walked over to Sophie and grabbed her arm. "We need to go, Sophie. Now." I watched them as they quickly gathered their coats and a few bags they had already packed near the door. They had known this day was coming, and they were already prepared to run. Sophie stopped at the doorway, her bag clutched tightly against her side. She looked back at me one last time. The anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, empty look that frightened me more than her rage ever had. "Goodbye, Luna," she said softly. "I hope your perfect life was worth it." They walked out the door, their footsteps echoing down the hallway until the building became completely silent. I stood alone in her messy apartment, surrounded by the ruins of our childhood and the heavy realization that the sister I grew up with was gone forever. I gathered the documents from the table, walked out to my car, and drove back to the hospital to make a formal report to the bank's fraud division. The healing process for my family could finally begin, but the scars would remain forever. The days following the confrontation at Sophie's apartment were a blur of legal meetings, bank phone calls, and police interviews. It turned out that Ryan had been the mastermind behind the technical details of the fraud, but Sophie had willingly used her identical face and stolen identification documents to sign the paperwork at a smaller bank branch outside the city. Because the bank's fraud division confirmed that the digital signatures and account access were unauthorized, Liam and I were officially cleared of any financial liability. The $50,000 debt was removed from our company name, and a formal investigation was launched to find Sophie and Ryan. They had disappeared completely, leaving behind their apartment and a trail of unpaid bills. My parents were devastated. Mom cried for days, wondering where she had gone wrong, while Dad sat in his favorite chair in absolute silence, staring out the window. I felt guilty for bringing this pain to their doorstep, but Dad eventually took my hand and reminded me that I had done what any mother would do to protect her child. Liam's recovery was slow, but the relief of knowing the truth seemed to give him a new strength. Without the constant, invisible worry of the missing funds and property deeds, his blood pressure stabilized, and the color slowly returned to his cheeks. We spent our afternoons sitting on the back porch, watching West play on a blanket in the grass. We didn't talk about Sophie. It was an unspoken agreement between us that our home needed to remain a sanctuary of peace, free from the anger and resentment that had almost destroyed us. We focused entirely on the small, beautiful moments of our daily life: West's first words, the sound of the evening rain against the window, and the simple comfort of holding hands in the dark before going to sleep. The love that had carried us through high school and college had survived its greatest test, and it felt deeper and more grounded than ever before. 3 years passed before we heard anything about Sophie again. West was now an energetic 4-year-old who loved running through the park and listening to his grandfather read history stories. Liam was completely healthy, his heart attack now a distant memory that only served to remind us how precious our time together was. Our business had grown steadily, and we had finally purchased a small, cozy cottage near the lake where we spent our weekends away from the noise of the city. Life had become peaceful, predictable, and full of a quiet joy that I thanked God for every single day. Then, on a cold Tuesday winter morning, an official envelope arrived from a government office in a neighboring state. I opened the letter at the kitchen table while Liam was setting out breakfast plates. It was a notice from a women's correctional facility. Sophie had been arrested 6 months earlier for an unrelated financial scam involving online marketplace fraud, and she was currently serving a 2-year sentence. The letter explained that as her closest living relative, I was being notified because she had listed my name on an emergency contact form. Liam looked at me across the table, seeing the stillness in my posture. "Luna, is everything okay?" I handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression serious but calm. He didn't look angry, he just looked sad. He handed the paper back to me and said softly, "It's your choice, Luna. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." The following weekend, I drove down to the correctional facility alone. The drive took nearly 4 hours, through gray landscapes and quiet towns that mirrored the mood in my heart. I hadn't come out of anger or a desire to see her punished. I had come because after 3 years of silence, I needed to look at my twin sister's face one last time to find a sense of closure for the little girl who had shared a womb and a childhood with her. The facility was cold and sterile, filled with the sounds of heavy doors locking and footsteps echoing down concrete corridors. I sat at a metal table in the visiting room, waiting behind a thick glass partition. When the door opened and Sophie was led into the room by a guard, my breath caught in my throat. She looked so different, yet so painfully familiar. The long, stylish hair she used to spend hours coloring was cut short and looked dull. She wore a simple orange uniform that made her look small and fragile. The sharp, angry look she had worn during our last argument was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She sat down in the chair across from me, looking at the plastic telephone receiver on her side of the glass. She hesitated for a long moment before picking it up. I lifted my receiver and placed it against my ear. "Hi, Luna," she whispered. Her voice sounded older, stripped of the bitterness that used to define it. "Hi, Sophie," I said softly. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. We just stared at each other's faces through the glass, looking at the identical features that life had shaped into completely different stories. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, looking down at her hands clutched in her lap. "I needed to see you," I replied honestly. "How are you?" She let out a small, tired sigh. "I'm okay. Ryan left me a year ago when the money ran out. He took what was left and disappeared. I got caught trying to fix things on my own, I guess. I guess I'm not as smart as I thought I was." "I'm sorry, Sophie," I said, and to my surprise, I genuinely meant it. I wasn't sorry that she was facing the consequences of her choices, but I was deeply sorry that her life had become so lonely and broken. "I used to hate you so much, Luna," she whispered, a tear finally rolling down her cheek. "I spent my whole life feeling like I was the defective version of you, but being in here, it gives you a lot of time to think. I realize now that you never tried to hurt me. You were just living your life. I was the one who made it a competition." Hearing those words felt like a heavy stone being lifted from my chest. The remaining anger I didn't even know I was carrying finally dissolved. "I loved you, Sophie," I said, my own tears starting to fall. "I always wanted you to be happy." She looked up at me, giving me a small, genuine smile that looked exactly like the one she had given me on my wedding day before the masks had taken over. "I know," she said. "I see that now. You don't have to come back here, Luna. I don't expect you to be my sister again. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." The guard tapped on her shoulder, indicating that our time was up. Sophie stood up slowly, holding the receiver to her ear for one last second. "Take care of Mom and Dad," she whispered. "And give West a hug for me." She hung up the phone, turned around, and walked back through the heavy steel door without looking back. I sat there for a minute, holding the silent phone against my ear, watching the empty doorway. The drive home felt lighter. The gray sky had cleared, and the evening sun was casting a warm, golden light over the highway. When I pulled into our driveway, the house looked warm and welcoming, the lights shining through the living room windows. As I walked through the front door, West ran down the hallway and threw his arms around my legs, laughing as he told me about a drawing he had made at preschool. Liam walked out of the kitchen, wearing an apron and smiling warmly as he asked how the drive had been. I pulled both of them into a tight hug, closing my eyes and breathing in the familiar scent of my home. The scars from our story would always remain, a reminder of the storm we had survived. But as I looked at my husband and my son, I knew that the foundation we had built was unbreakable. The shadow of my sister was finally gone, and the light in my home had never been brighter. 6 months passed after my visit to the correctional facility, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm again. The wounds our family had carried for so many years hadn't completely disappeared, but they no longer controlled our days. Liam was healthier than he had been in years, throwing himself into family life instead of endless work. Every Saturday morning, he and West would make pancakes together in the kitchen. The pancakes were rarely round, and somehow they always ended up with too much chocolate syrup. But hearing their laughter fill the house reminded me that happiness didn't have to be perfect to be real. It only had to be shared. Our business continued to grow steadily, but we had both changed our priorities. We no longer measured success by numbers in a bank account or the size of our investments. Success was eating dinner together every evening. It was watching West race across the backyard with his toy airplane while Liam chased after him pretending to be a monster. It was sitting on the porch after sunset, holding hands in comfortable silence, grateful for the ordinary moments that once seemed so easy to overlook. One quiet Saturday afternoon, I decided to organize the hallway closet that had slowly become a place where old memories collected dust. Boxes filled with photographs, children's books, and forgotten holiday decorations were stacked neatly against the wall. As I reached for one of the highest shelves, I heard little footsteps running toward me. "Mommy," West called happily. He was holding a small cardboard box that he had somehow managed to pull from the bottom shelf. I found this. I smiled and knelt beside him before gently taking the box into my hands. It was old, its edges worn from time, and I honestly couldn't remember the last time I had opened it. When I lifted the lid, I froze. Inside were two tiny friendship bracelets made from colorful strings. The colors had faded after so many years, but they were still carefully tied together exactly as we had left them. One bracelet had my name written in crooked little letters. The other had Sophie's. For a long moment, I simply stared at them. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in my hallway anymore. I was 8 years old again, sitting beside my twin sister on our bedroom floor while we laughed over tangled pieces of string, proudly promising each other that we'd always be best friends. At that age, we believed promises lasted forever. "Whose bracelets are they?" West asked softly. "They belong to your aunt and me," I answered with a small smile. "We made them when we were children." He looked at the bracelets with wide, curious eyes before looking back at me. "Were you best friends?" I nodded slowly. "We were." He thought quietly for a few seconds before asking the question I knew would come. "What happened?" I looked toward the living room window where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. "Sometimes," I said gently, "people make choices that change everything. Your aunt made choices that hurt a lot of people, especially herself." West frowned, trying to understand something far bigger than his young heart could fully carry. "Did she stop loving you?" The question caught me by surprise. I lowered my eyes to the bracelets resting in my hands. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But I know she forgot how to love without comparing, without competing, and without letting jealousy grow inside her." He stayed quiet for another moment before asking one final question. "Do you still love her?" A tear slipped quietly down my cheek. "I do," I whispered. "Love doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it simply changes. I can love someone and still know they can't be part of my life. Forgiveness doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it just means choosing peace instead of carrying anger forever." West wrapped his little arms around my waist without saying another word. "I'll always protect you, Mommy." I smiled through my tears and kissed the top of his head. "I know you will." That evening, after West had fallen asleep and Liam was reading quietly in the living room, I carried the little box upstairs. I opened it one last time, gently touched the faded bracelets, and smiled at the childhood they represented instead of the pain that came afterward. Then I closed the lid. I didn't throw the box away. Some memories deserve to be kept, not because we want to relive them, but because they remind us how far we've come. I placed the box on the highest shelf, turned off the closet light, and quietly closed the door. As I walked back downstairs toward the sound of Liam's laughter and West's sleepy voice calling for one more bedtime hug, I realized something that had taken me years to understand. The greatest victory wasn't that I had survived betrayal. It was that betrayal had never taken away my ability to love, to trust, or to build a beautiful life with the people who truly chose me. And for the first time in many years, the past no longer felt like a shadow behind me. It simply became another chapter of the story that led me home.